The Japanese executive didn't say a word when he walked out. He just stood up, straightened his jacket, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the door like the meeting was already over. Like the 47 people sitting around that conference table didn't exist. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 47 people in that room. 6 lawyers, 4 translators, 2 CFOs, 1 CEO, and enough combined net worth to build a small country. And not one of them said a single word as Haruto Yamamoto walked toward that glass door. That's when Cornelius Webb, the man everyone in that room had counted out before he ever said a word, pushed back his chair and stood up. He was 63 years old. He had liver spots on the back of his hands and a hearing aid in his left ear. He was wearing a name badge that said maintenance, and his gray uniform had a small bleach stain near the left pocket from when he'd cleaned the supply closet 2 floors up earlier that morning. "Mr. Yamamoto," he said. His voice was quiet, not nervous. Just quiet the way a man gets quiet when he's spent 63 years learning exactly how much noise he needs to make to be heard. Haruto Yamamoto stopped with his hand on the door. He turned around slowly. And the room, that massive, glass-walled conference room on the 38th floor of the Aldridge Tower, the room where a $400 million acquisition was falling apart in real time, went completely silent. 3 weeks earlier, nobody at Aldridge Capital knew Cornelius Webb's last name. He'd been working the night maintenance shift at that building for 11 years. He came in at 6 in the evening and left at 2 in the morning, and in 11 years the number of people who had asked him anything beyond, "Can you get that water stain off the glass?" could be counted on one hand. His supervisor, a man named Ron, called him the old man on nights. The security desk called him maintenance. The cleaning crew called him Mr. C, which was the closest anyone had gotten to his actual name in years. Cornelius didn't mind. He'd learned a long time ago that being overlooked had its own kind of freedom. He'd grown up in Savannah, Georgia, the second of 5 children, in a house where the electricity went out more than it stayed on. His mother cleaned houses. His father worked the docks. Neither of them had gone past 8th grade, and neither of them ever pretended that the world was going to hand their children anything. What they gave him instead was language. His father had worked alongside Japanese dock workers for 15 years. He'd picked up the language the way dock workers pick up everything, slowly, stubbornly, through repetition and necessity. He taught Cornelius the way he knew how, at the dinner table, on the walk to school, on the bus to church, not from a textbook, from memory, from need. By the time Cornelius was 12, he could argue with his father in Japanese. By the time he was 16, he could read it. By the time he was 22, he had tested at an advanced level with a language institute in Atlanta and been told politely that he had an extraordinary natural aptitude. He'd never done anything with it. Life had other plans. His first wife got sick when he was 29. Medical bills. His second job disappeared when the plant closed. He raised 2 daughters, mostly alone after his wife passed, working whatever shifts he could get, doing what needed to be done, putting his daughters through school on a maintenance worker's wages, and the kind of pride that doesn't announce itself. His daughters were grown now. One was a nurse in Baltimore. The other was a civil engineer in Phoenix. He was proud of them in the steady, quiet way he was proud of most things, without making a performance of it. He'd ended up at Aldridge Capital because a friend had told him the night shift paid better than the cleaning company he'd been with. He'd applied. He'd been hired. He showed up every night at 6, did his work, and went home. For 11 years, nobody asked him anything else. The acquisition had been in the works for 8 months. Aldridge Capital was trying to buy Yamamoto Group's American real estate holdings, a portfolio of commercial properties across 7 cities, valued at roughly $400 million. It was the biggest deal Aldridge had ever attempted, and it had taken 8 months of negotiations, 2 separate legal teams, a parade of consultants, and more catered lunches than anyone wanted to count. The lead negotiator on Aldridge's side was a woman named Sinclair Rhodes, 41 years old, Harvard Law, 12 years at the firm, the kind of person who made other people feel slightly underprepared just by walking into the room. She was good at her job. She knew she was good at her job, and she didn't apologize for it. The problem wasn't Sinclair's competence. The problem was the document. 8 months of negotiation had produced a 300-page acquisition agreement, and somewhere in those 300 pages, in a clause that dealt with the transfer of naming rights for one of the subsidiary properties, a phrase had been translated incorrectly from Japanese into English. It wasn't a big phrase. It was 7 words in Japanese that became 9 words in English. And the 9 English words changed the meaning just enough to make Haruto Yamamoto believe that Aldridge Capital intended to rename one of his family's flagship properties, a hotel in Chicago that had carried the Yamamoto name for 31 years. His grandfather had built that hotel. Haruto Yamamoto was not a man who showed emotion in business settings. He'd been in American boardrooms enough times to know that showing emotion was considered a weakness, and he'd learned to keep his face still, and his voice measured even when he was furious. But when Sinclair walked through the clause in question during that meeting, when she said, with complete confidence, that the naming rights transfer was standard practice, and had been clearly communicated throughout the process, something in Haruto Yamamoto's expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough for anyone paying close attention to catch it. He stood up, he straightened his jacket, he picked up his briefcase, and he walked toward the door. Sinclair's co-counsel, a younger man named Pierce, said, "Mr. Yamamoto, if there's a concern." Haruto didn't stop walking. One of the Japanese translators stood up and said something rapid and quiet. The other translator looked at his hands, and that's when the door opened from the outside, and Cornelius Webb walked in with a cart, 2 replacement water pitchers, and a stack of fresh napkins, because someone had texted maintenance that the pitchers on the conference room table needed to be swapped out before 3 o'clock. He took in the room in 1 second. He'd spent 11 years reading rooms. He could tell from 40 feet away that something had gone badly wrong. He set the cart down quietly near the wall. He picked up one of the pitchers. He started moving toward the table, and Haruto Yamamoto walked past him toward the door. That's when Cornelius put the pitcher down. That's when he said, "Mr. Yamamoto." The room turned to look at him, all 47 people, the lawyers, the CFOs, Sinclair Rhodes, Pierce, the 2 translators. Haruto Yamamoto turned around. He looked at the old man in the maintenance uniform. He said nothing. Cornelius Webb walked toward him. Not fast, not hesitant, just steady, the way he walked when he had somewhere to be. And then he said, in Japanese, "The clause doesn't say what they think it says." Haruto Yamamoto blinked. "Forgive me," Cornelius continued, in Japanese, his accent carrying the particular cadence of Savannah, overlaid with 30 years of reading, watching, and listening. "I know this isn't my place, but I've been listening from the hall, and I think the problem is in the translation, not the intention." The room was absolutely silent. One of the Japanese translators, a young man from Chicago who had a degree from Northwestern, and had been translating corporate documents for 6 years, stared at Cornelius Webb with an expression that was impossible to read. Haruto Yamamoto said, in Japanese, "Who are you?" "My name is Cornelius Webb," he said. "I maintain this building." Another pause. "My father worked the docks in Savannah," Cornelius said. "He worked alongside Japanese men for 15 years. He taught me what he learned. I never stopped practicing." Haruto Yamamoto looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, also in Japanese, "What do you think the clause says?" Cornelius reached into the breast pocket of his uniform. He pulled out a small, worn notebook, the kind you can buy at a drugstore for $2, with the black and white mottled cover. He carried it because he still practiced. Even after 63 years, he still wrote things down in Japanese to keep the language sharp. He opened it to a blank page. He wrote out the clause from memory, the Japanese original, which he'd read on a document that had been left on the table during a break 3 weeks ago when he'd come in to clean up after a working lunch. He handed it to Haruto Yamamoto. Haruto read it. He read it again. Then he looked up at the Japanese translator and said something sharp and quiet. The translator looked at the page. He looked at the contract. He looked at his hands. He said something back to Haruto, slower, less certain. Haruto turned to Sinclair Rhodes. Your document, he said in English, does not say what you told me it says. What it says is that the naming rights are preserved, not transferred. The intent was to protect the property name, not to change it. Sinclair stared at him. Then she looked at Pierce. Then she looked at the original translator, who had been with their firm for 4 years. That's, Pierce started. The word your translator used, Haruto said quietly, means transfer. The word in the original document means preserve. They look similar. They are not the same. The original translator had gone pale. Sinclair picked up the document. She read the clause. She looked at Cornelius Webb. He was standing quietly near the wall. He had picked up the picture again. He was holding it with both hands. Is that right? She said. Is that what it says? He looked at her. I'm a maintenance worker, ma'am. I don't know anything about contracts. But the translation, she said. Is it a translation error? Cornelius Webb was quiet for a moment. Yes, ma'am, he said. What happened in the next 2 hours was not the kind of thing that usually gets remembered in the official story. The lawyers talked. The translators went back through the document. Pierce called the original translator into a side room, and whatever happened in that room stayed in that room, but the man didn't come back to the table. Sinclair requested a recess. Haruto agreed. During the recess, someone at Aldridge Capital apparently started asking questions about the man in the maintenance uniform who spoke Japanese. By the time the meeting reconvened, 3 people at the firm had already Googled Cornelius Webb and found exactly nothing, because there was nothing to find. He was a maintenance worker who came in at 6 and left at 2 and had never once sought recognition for anything. When the meeting reconvened, the clause was corrected. It took 40 minutes and 2 different translators confirming the same conclusion. The property name would be preserved. The deal would go forward. Haruto Yamamoto, before he sat back down at the table, walked over to where Cornelius was finishing with the water pitchers. He said, in Japanese, "Thank you." Cornelius nodded. Haruto paused. Then he said, "Where did you say your father worked?" "The docks in Savannah," Cornelius said. "Port of Savannah, for about 15 years until his back gave out." Haruto was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather came through that port," he said. In 1961, he was bringing his first shipment of goods to the American market. He said the dock workers there were the most honest men he had ever done business with. Cornelius looked at him. "He said there was one man," Haruto continued, "who spoke to him in Japanese when no one else could, who helped him understand the customs paperwork, who refused to accept money for it because he said it was just the right thing to do." The room had mostly cleared out during the recess. Just the 2 of them near the window, the city spread out below them in the afternoon light. "I don't know if that was your father," Haruto said, "but I think it might have been." Cornelius didn't say anything for a moment. He looked out at the city. "My father helped a lot of people," he said finally. "He never talked about it. That wasn't his way." Haruto nodded slowly. Then he said, "It seems to run in the family." Sinclair Rhodes came to find Cornelius before he left that evening. He was already back on his regular rounds. 3rd floor, east wing, the hallway bathrooms that always needed an extra pass on Wednesday nights. She found him there, cleaning solution in hand, working his way down the tile. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked up. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. He nodded and kept working. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "Why didn't you say anything earlier, when you read the document 3 weeks ago?" He was quiet for a moment. He ran the mop across the tile. He thought about how to explain something that didn't fully translate into English, or maybe into any language that had never had to learn the hard way that nobody wants to hear from the man in the maintenance uniform. "Who was I going to tell?" he said. She didn't answer right away. "I could have gone to someone," he said, and said, "Excuse me, I was cleaning up after your working lunch and I read your contract and I think there's a translation error." "And what happens then?" He didn't say it bitterly. He said it the way you say something that is simply true. I get walked out the door. Maybe I lose my job. Maybe someone calls building security. And the meeting goes the way it was going to go anyway. Sinclair was quiet. But today, he said, the man was already leaving. So I didn't have anything to lose. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she said, Mr. Webb, do you have any idea what you did today? He kept mopping. I corrected a translation error, he said. You saved a $400 million deal. He looked up at her then, and for the first time that day something in his face shifted. Not pride, exactly, but something close to it. The quiet, stubborn satisfaction of a man who had spent 63 years being told, in 100 different ways, that what he carried wasn't worth anything. I imagine, he said, you would have figured it out eventually. Maybe, she said. But the deal would have been dead by then. He nodded slowly. He went back to mopping. My father used to say, he said, that a man's value isn't in what he puts on his resume. It's in what he does when nobody's looking. Sinclair Rhodes stood there for a moment longer. She looked like she wanted to say something else. Then she nodded once and walked back down the hall. The acquisition closed 6 weeks later. There was a signing ceremony on the 38th floor with catered food and champagne and the kind of quiet celebration that people in finance have when they close a very large deal. Contained, professional, aware of its own significance. Cornelius Webb was not invited. He was that evening doing his rounds on the 14th floor. He found out about the closing the same way he found out about most things. Ron mentioned it in passing while handing out the shift assignments. Big signing today, Ron said. They're going to need the 38th cleaned top to bottom tomorrow morning. I'll take care of it, Cornelius said. He did. He arrived at 6 the next morning instead of 6 in the evening. He cleaned the conference room while the city was still dark below. The skyline of the city just beginning to catch the first gray light of morning. The champagne glasses were still in a catering crate in the corner. The table had a few water rings on it that would need polishing. He polished them out. He was done by 9. On his way out, the morning receptionist, a young woman named Adeze who had started 3 months ago, and was the only person on the morning desk who consistently said good morning to him, called out as he passed. Mr. Webb, she said. He stopped. She held out an envelope. He opened it. Inside was a note on Aldridge Capital letterhead. It said, Mr. Webb, we are aware of your contribution to the Yamamoto acquisition. We would like to discuss your future here. Please see HR at your earliest convenience. Below that was a second, smaller card, handwritten, in Japanese. He read it. It said, my grandfather helped a dock worker's family in Savannah in 1963. He paid for the oldest son's night school tuition anonymously, because the man had helped him when he had nothing. I believe that oldest son was your father. This is overdue. H. Yamamoto. Cornelius Webb stood in the lobby of the Aldridge Tower for a long moment. He folded both notes carefully and put them in the breast pocket of his uniform, next to the worn notebook. He walked out into the morning. I think about Cornelius Webb a lot. I think about the version of this story that almost happened. The version where he reads that document 3 weeks earlier and says nothing. Because he knows what happens to maintenance workers who try to correct lawyers, and the deal falls apart, and nobody ever knows what was lost. I think about all the meetings happening right now, in buildings all over this country, where the person who could fix the problem is holding a mop or a pitcher or a set of keys, and nobody thinks to ask. We talk a lot about talent, about finding it, developing it, not wasting it, but what we really mean, most of the time, is talent that announces itself. Talent with credentials. Talent that comes packaged in the right clothes, in the right room, with the right title on a business card. Cornelius Webb spent 63 years carrying something extraordinary. His father gave it to him at a dinner table in Savannah, word by word, and he kept it alive through 2 marriages and a widowing, and 2 daughters and 11 years of night shifts. Because language was the one thing nobody could take from him, even when they took everything else. He didn't get famous. He didn't get a TED Talk or a profile in a business magazine. He got a note in an envelope and an HR meeting and a story that almost nobody knows. But here's what I know. $400 million moved because a 63-year-old man in a maintenance uniform decided that when there was nothing left to lose, he might as well speak. Don't tell me what someone's capable of based on what they're wearing. Don't tell me a person's worth from the room they clean, or the cart they push, or the badge clipped to their chest. You don't know what they're carrying. You never know what they're carrying.